entering week 6 of the season of Lent, and we have an interesting passage here. Of course, it's Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday weekend. The theme is illuminate. I am going to confess that the theme doesn't automatically suggest itself from the scripture that we've been given. But it is one that we're going to lean into a little bit with the question that I asked during the presentation that we'll revive again here. And that is Jesus a king? And if the answer is yes, in what sense? And if the answer is no, why not? Okay, so we're gonna discuss that after we look at this text and the accompaniment text a little bit more. All right, so let's start out by just reading through this. This is John's version of what we call the triumphal entry. Almost every biblical commentator will tell you that Chad Myers argues convincingly in his book, Binding the Strong Man, that we should not call this the triumphal entry, that none of the Gospels presents it as such. And then after all of those biblical scholars will tell you that, they will say, however, for the sake of familiarity, I'm just going to refer to it as a triumphal entry. I feel the same way. I think Chad Myers is correct. It's not really depicting a triumphal entry in the way that first century folks thought of those. But that's such a handy phrase that I'm so accustomed to speaking of it that way that you'll hear me say that today. Just know there's a caveat every time I say it. All right. So we'll read verses 12 through 15. The next day, the great crowd that had come to Jerusalem, had come to the festival, heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. This ends the reading. Okay. All right. What questions did you have following your reading of the text or following your witnessing the presentation? Yes, sir.
Is it just the time where women are not accounted for as we would wish them to be, that we have fear, daughters of Zion, in all 4 versions that I've got? Why identify the women? We have fear not through the a number of other places.
Right. Yeah, so that's really a question.
And is it worthwhile discussing? I don't.
Oh, sure. It's always, yeah. But it's probably really a question for Zechariah. So let's just scroll back there for a second. So in Zechariah chapter 9, it is he who starts this. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. So Zechariah is the one who enters the feminine language there and uses it to describe Zion, which is not an actual place. It's the ideal place. It's the aspired place. And Jerusalem, which would be for sure the capital city. I don't know if it was common to refer to cities and locations as a she like it is to do today with ships. You almost always refer to a ship as she. I don't know. But it goes back to Zechariah's day. And the gospel writers, insofar as they use that language, are just being faithful to what Zechariah said. Yeah. Beyond that, I don't know. That's a good question. I've never really thought about it. So, Yes, sir.
Why didn't Jesus walk into Jerusalem?
That was my question. Because he
He had
wants,
a cadre of people and.
but he's fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Mhm.
So either he's fulfilling a prophecy, or maybe Jesus did walk into Jerusalem, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John want to demonstrate that Jesus' entry is fulfilling a prophecy.
Mm.
So they tell the story the way they do.
Mm.
Okay, I know that sounds a little questionable to put it that way, because what I'm disconnecting is the story and the actual historicity of the event.
Mm.
And the reason I'm allowing ourselves to think about that is because all four gospels tell it very differently. I mean, somewhat differently. I don't want to say very, but somewhat differently.
Mm.
So there already is a disconnect between the stories and the actual event. Jesus is not Schrodinger's cat. He could not have ridden in on one animal and at the same time have ridden in on two animals. Can't do that, right? So what we have is an event that happened, and what we have are four different accounts of how that event happened. So there's already a little disconnect. Are you suggesting that it would have seemed humbler for Jesus to walk into Jerusalem, or simpler or something? What advantage would you see in Jesus having walked?
Well, you follow someone of importance. And I don't know, it seems like the animal moves him beyond the connection with the crowd. So I see processions of leaders walking in with, their army following them. Because I see this as maybe not as triumphant, but as a sacrifice almost. He's walking to his own sacrifice. But
Yeah. All right, let me give you,
it just seems to me.
yeah, let me give you a couple ways of looking at this. You're suggesting Jesus walking might have had a different connotation. For example, when the president's motorcade is going down to the inauguration, and ever since Carter, I think, they stop and the presidents get out and walk,
Right.
to be with the people,
Mhm.
right? So that's a sign of kind of humility and a symbol of democracy,
Mhm.
as opposed to aristocracy, believe it or not. And so on the one hand, that might have been pretty symbolic had Jesus alighted off of the donkey and walked. If Jesus had simply walked, nobody would have recognized anything, because he was always walking about.
Mm.
And in John's gospel, this is not Jesus' first visit to Jerusalem. He actually cleanses the temple twice in John's gospel, at the beginning and the end. This is his third visit that we know of in John's gospel to Jerusalem. So the other side, though, is that, and again, many biblical scholars will point out that it was a thing for triumphant leaders to process into this capital city of the nation they just conquered. So about 200 years before John was written, a Seleucid king, Antiochus, defeated the Ptolemaic kingdom and took control of Jerusalem. And Josephus, the historian, writing a couple hundred years later, writes about how Antiochus came processing into Jerusalem and was welcomed with joyful singing and crowns and stuff like that. Now, whether they were really happy he was there, whether they liked the Seleucids more than the Ptolemaic, I don't know. Or whether they just thought, well, this guy's in charge now, let's get on his good side. I imagine that had something to do with it.
Was he walking or riding?
He was riding, and he would come riding in, and he'd be surrounded by a flanks of military. So it was always a military show. It was not like a U.S. president riding in the limousine, getting out and walking, going to be inaugurated by the people. It was more like, in countries that have these military parades and they bring the big weapons by and the soldiers and all that, and everybody stops to honor that person. So it's intended to be a show of power. So one of the suggestions is that you can call this a triumphal entry because Jesus is imitating that very thing that tyrants and other conquerors would do. But Jesus subverts the whole thing because he's not riding on a mighty steed. He's riding on a baby colt, a baby donkey. He's riding on
That's
the opposite.
the lowest.
Yes, a beast of burden. I mean, it's not an ox, but it is a donkey, and it's the foal of a donkey. So he is not riding into battle. That is not what you take into battle. It's not ready. And so he's coming in as the anti-king. So it's a mixture of imitation and subversion going on when Jesus, instead of just walking in, which wouldn't have been notable, and instead of riding on a steed, which would have been absolute imitation, he comes in riding on a mount of a foal, which imitates and subverts. I think it's masterful storytelling, if you ask me. But yes, Shirley.
I grew up with that though, that he came in on the lowliest animal of that sort. I'm sure there might have been horses and stuff, because that it signified his attachment to the people who were treated lower and underly. But I mean, that's how I grew up learning.
Yeah, I think I think for sure it is whether someone riding on the foal of a donkey in and of itself would have been seen as a sign of humility. I don't know. There's so little reference to anybody riding anything in the Gospels.
Sure.
Back in the Old Testament, they ride all kinds of stuff. So I don't know whether that in itself, but certainly when you put it in the context of an entry into the capital city. And one thing John doesn't do that Mark does and Matthew and Luke do is Jesus not only rides in, but he goes to the temple, which is what Antiochus did. When he rode in, he went to the temple where he was anointed and all of that by the priest as their new ruler. Now, ironically, 60 years later, his descendant Antiochus Epiphanes IV, destroyed the temple. He treated it as a sacrilege, sacrificed a pig to Jupiter on the altar. So, but in the other Gospels, it's even more apparent that what Jesus is doing is imitating the typical triumphal entry, but subverting it by riding on a colt.
His own No King's Parade.
Well, that's my sermon title this week. Is but it's the question we have to hold with this. I mean, is this a king parade or a no king parade? Is Jesus a king or a not king? Is he a king or the anti-king? Yes, sir.
Growing up, my best friend's family raised quarter horses, and so I got kind of a background image of when a colt can be called a foal, meaning it has to reach a certain age where its body structure can support the weight of an average weighted human. And so once that stage is reached, then the foal becomes a colt that can be ridden. But just as a king usually arrives in a limousine to get out and walk, Christ, if he's on a foal or a colt, whatever word is used, this is something unusual. It's something that is very special. It's something you don't often see. It's something you don't often witness. How can this be?
Right.
This man, a fully grown man in his 30s, is riding on an animal that's never been ridden before. and the animal is not acting like this is something that can't be happening to me. I don't know if any of that plays into it or not, but that kind of struck out to me. That
Yeah.
image.
Yeah, and my guess is that the biblical language wasn't quite as specific as the equine language has become these days. But they certainly are making a distinction that this is not a war animal or not a fully grown animal. I mean, I want to think Jesus didn't sit on something that wasn't ready to bear his weight. Ended up falling apart later. But yeah,
You could have resurrected it.
yeah, he could have raised that thing and watch it go on. Okay, here's the other part of the parade, I'll call it, that is interesting is the palm branches. And when I walked through each of the four tellings of the story, they don't all have palm branches. Luke's is awful. They just throw their clothes. What good is that? Clothes Sunday we would be having every year if we just read Luke's gospel. Palm branches. I think I've told you this story before, but I'm going to tell you again. I was in El Salvador one time, and we were going to have a celebration. It was going to be the 30th anniversary or the 20th anniversary of some friends of mine who were traveling with us there who had done a lot for this small community called El Tablon. So it's their 20th anniversary, and it happened also to be the date of the 25th anniversary of the murder of Archbishop Romero, who was Oscar Romero, big hero among the peasants in El Salvador. Such a big deal that they kept saying our friends were celebrating their 25th anniversary. And I just finally looked at him and said, just go with it. Just for today, this is your 25th anniversary. You get 5 bonus years. Because it was such a significant day etched in their mind when Romero was shot and killed. They all remembered that day. So we're having this celebration. And this is how peasants celebrate. Okay. First of all, they fix food. They don't have a lot, but they somehow put it all together and there's a lot. But we were aware that they didn't have a lot to start. So the day before, we sent a lot of food up there. And that gave them the honor of being able to host us with a big feast. They fix food. Secondly, they don't have a fellowship hall. I mean, these were dirt floor huts where they lived. And so we got there that morning and they built one. And they they had a lot of palm trees, really tall palm trees. And they would take some of the younger ones and cut them down and just dig the pole down into the ground and pack them in to where you've got this like 10-foot pole sticking up out of the ground. And they just knew how to do it. And they persisted at it. They had a few instruments to help get the ground ready, but then it was just a matter of persistent muscle. And they put these poles up, and then they had some twine that they had developed off of trees, and strung them from pole to pole. And then they strung some down and used stakes to hold them up. And then this dude climbed up one of those palm trees. And we decided we'd give it a shot. I don't think a single American got higher than 4 feet. Man, and even then, just the marks it leaves on your arms and the calluses. This guy just scampered up that tree, took his machete, and would cut a branch, and we'd all back up and would fall. And these are huge palm branches. And they started laying them across those poles. And within about 2.5 hours, a piece of bare dirt was covered, and they brought in tables, and we had a feast under it. It was amazing. So this is how peasants do celebration. They use what is available to them, and they make something powerful out of it. So these folks running, cutting palm branches, that just makes all kinds of sense. Because now you have something that's just lovely. And you can swirl with it, you can wave it, you can throw it, you can if they're big enough, you can fan people with it, you can do all kinds of things. So what we have is a peasant parade. There's not gold, there's not jewelry, there's not silver, they're not, baths of acid milk or anything like, that luxury stuff that people of these times might have enjoyed if you were a king. None of that. It's just peasant stuff, peasants making party. That's what's going on here. And so that also drills down a little bit that if this looks like a typical triumphal entry from the king of conquering king, it's not. It's kind of the peasants who rule nobody, making celebration as only they know how.
Makes sense.
Pretty cool, huh? Yes, Jim.
So I was wondering why they yelled Hosanna. Now, I get that they're under Roman occupation and they want to be saved from that maybe. But,
Not maybe that they want to be saved from that, period.
well, why that word?
Yeah, That's a
saved?
good question. Yeah,
If it's a triumph, I mean, if they knew about him,
Yeah.
which they supposedly did.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They must have seen him as the king to be saved from their oppression. Or wouldn't they? I don't
Yeah.
know. That just seems like an odd welcoming chant.
right. But I mean, I'm certainly would agree with you. They saw him as someone to save them from oppression. Whether that had to be a king or not, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know the mentality of the time. But they certainly use that language as well. Why Hosanna? It is in the Old Testament, but not frequently, and it's not used, over and over like Hallelujah. Another borrowed term that people who generally speak Aramaic will borrow from the Old Testament and say. It seemed to be a translation of the phrase "save us," "Lord save us," or something like that, but we're not really sure because it's not a common term. And the way you know what biblical terms mean is by the repetition. That's how you figure out, oh, that means food, because here it is over and over again on the table. So it seems to me, Lord save us, it seems to be a cry of liberation. It appears, I wish I could tell you, I can't tell you, maybe one of your study Bibles will tell us.
Mine only says Hebrew expression meaning save.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know how often it appears in
It says also, which became an exclamation of praise. I don't know.
yeah. Well, and to some extent, we're trying to figure that out. That's what biblical scholars do. We try to figure that out. We have to guess a little bit and look at the evidence. And there's just not a whole lot of it there. Would somebody look up Psalm 118, verses 25 and 26? I'm curious as to what that says. I don't know that the word is going to appear there. I just want to know what that says. Right? Because I'm seeing it as a reference in this study Bible, and I'm not recalling off the top of my head.
118, what?
25 and 26.
Save us, we beseech you, O Lord. O Lord, we beseech you to give us success.
Okay. I would imagine that in Hebrew, that save us is Hosanna. Which is why it's marked here and where it comes from. Again, very infrequent in the Old Testament. So why each of the, why 3 of the 4 Gospels have the people saying Hosanna? Why the word Hosanna became associated with this event, I seriously don't know. I don't know if in the early or late first century, Hosanna was a term that people often used to cry out for liberation. At least the Jewish people speaking Hebrew. These folks didn't speak Hebrew generally. They spoke Aramaic. That was the effect of the Greek Empire coming through, is that their language changed. It didn't become Greek. They tried to resist that, but it certainly became something very much like Greek. What do you call it when Jews kind of mash up Hebrew and English?
Mishmash.
Yeah, kind of a mishmash. There's another term for
Yes, it's
Yiddish.
Yiddish
Yeah,
is a
yeah.
combination.
Yeah,
of
right, yeah,
What I was.
yeah. Is that what you said? Yeah, thank you.
that's Hebrew and German.
Yeah. Right. Hebrew and German became Yiddish over time, and I think Aramaic is kind of Hebrew and Greek Yiddish sort of language, but it was a common language. It's what Jesus grew up speaking. It's what he said when he taught. It's all these conversations here are in Aramaic. But Greek was the written language. So if you're a writer, you're going to write in Greek. And every now and then you'll notice the different writers will interpret an Aramaic word. That is to say, da da da. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Aramaic, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? So, so somehow this Hebrew word not only lasted from Hebrew, but also made it through the Aramaic common speech and the Greek written language and was preserved as the word that was used here. And why it's fairly consistently part of this event, I'm not sure. Done?
Yeah, your story about the palm branches just triggered a memory in my mind. I don't know if it happened at a VBS or something when I was a child, but someone said that Christ was leaving Jericho, to go to Jerusalem. The indigenous palm tree that was around Jericho was the kind that the trunk comes up and then the whole branch has the fronds coming off of it, the individual things that you could probably make a hula skirt out of, I guess, or a basket or something. But the indigenous palm tree that was closer to Jerusalem came up, and then you had the branch that came out that had all those little thorny parts, and then you had the fan. It was the fan. So the branch came and then there was the fan. So you often see the king being fanned with the thing.
Interesting.
And that memory came back to me when you were telling that about that, I could see them picking up the kind of thing that come. We had a queen palm, would you say it was? A huge one removed from our backyard so we could put a fence in to keep the German Shepherd on our property. And it had this huge 10 to 12 feet long branches, started right at that big old trunk. And then the neighbors have one, and there's those big old branches in the fan palm. So there are different species of palms.
Yeah, for sure.
Actually, here you don't have to do anything more than just walk around. You'll probably see 6 or 7 different varieties of palm.
That's true.
From the ones that we're used to on Hawaii that go lovely and to have the coconuts at the bottom, of which you can't climb.
But what got it here was in 11, it says Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So he's not there yet.
Right. So he's starting from Bethany,
Yeah.
which is in John's Gospel where Lazarus lives. And so there's Jericho, and then Bethany and Bethphage are kind of like suburbs of Greater Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
So not in Jerusalem proper, but there. I remember the first time I went to Chicago, I kept saying, "Are we there yet?" Because it sure looked like we were in Chicago. And they're like, "Yeah, we'll be there in 4 miles." I'm like, if this isn't Chicago, what is? I mean, right? But no, we're in Oak Park, or we're in the right. So yeah, we're entering now. Okay, the other thing I pointed out in the video is how different John's telling is from the other three. Because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus orchestrates all of this. And I guess I just grew up thinking that when Jesus sent two people into town and someone said, "Why are you untying the colt?" and they said, "The master needs it," that some kind of magic happened. And they said, "Oh, okay, take our colt." It wasn't until I read John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Ford's book the last week that they said Jesus planned all of this ahead of time. Jesus made arrangements because Jesus really was quite the community organizer. He'll do the same thing when it comes to the Last Supper. He will have a place already ready, and they go in and ask someone, where are we to have our meal? And they'll show you. I always kind of thought that was kind of magical. But now I'm thinking, wow, Jesus is an organizer of these events, but not in John. In John's story, the people start this. Then Jesus finds, it's funny, the Greek word that's translated find in found in verse 14. I looked it up one time and it said it either means to find something after having looked for it or to find something without having looked for it. And I thought, why bring it up? Why bring it up? Just say find something and leave it at that. But Jesus finds a colt, and either he was looking around for a colt, or he just, oh, look, there's a colt. But it's in response to the people, and that I don't know exactly what significance that has, but it's a very different way of presenting the story.
Who was John's audience? I'm curious as to why his gospel is so different.
Yeah. So the notion is that John was written considerably later than the other three gospels. So the majority school of thought places Mark's gospel around 70 of the Common Era. So it will have been written just before, during, or just after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Matthew and Luke are typically dated about mid-80s, somewhere around there. And John maybe closer to 90 of the Common Era. And I don't know all the exact
90 years from the crucifixion?
90 of the Common Era, which yeah, CE or AD it used to be called. And Jesus was probably born about 4 years before the Common Era started. I mean, whoever came up with the calendar missed. And so if Jesus were 33-ish when he died, and that's not for certain, then John's gospel would have been close to 60 years later. Who John's audience is, I'm not sure. What's really interesting is that John directly addresses his audience a lot. Well, not a lot, but at the end of the gospel, these things are written so that you might believe, and in doing so have life in his name. So John looks to the camera and talks to it right at the end of the movie. But who is the you? It's hard to say. It's really kind of hard to say. There is one quality of John's gospel that we have to recognize. I don't know if it helps us locate it, but by the time and in the place where John wrote, there's a much stronger animus between the Christian community and the Jewish leadership.
In the time that John wrote.
In the time, at least by the time John wrote, because the way John shapes the stories, I mean, there are some who say that John's gospel is very anti-Semitic. I think that's a misnomer. That's often a misnomer, I think, but it's a misnomer here because I think John is probably Jewish. And this is an internal conversation. But if you go back and read, like, for instance, chapter 9, the story about the man who's born blind, he is excommunicated from the temple because he gives Jesus credit for his healing and not just God. And it's the temple leaders that do that. And you can almost tell by the way that story is shaped that John or John's community had been excommunicated and see the temple leadership as a problem. Now, John's language is that John will speak often of the Judaoi, which is typically translated the Jews in the Gospels. I always translated the Judean. I think it's a much more refined translation and more accurate. You see it in Mark's gospel, it seems like the Galilean and the Judeans have a little rivalry going on there. In John's gospel is the early Christian community in the Judeans. And after the resurrection in John's gospel, the disciples are hidden in a room and the door is locked for fear of the Judeans. So you get a sense that what we're doing is we're writing to people whose experience is that the Judeans have some kind of oppressive power over them. So I don't know exactly to whom, but one would think that their proximity is very close to Jerusalem for the Judeans to have that kind of power and for excommunication to be a genuine threat. And my guess is that John's audience is a late first century Jewish audience. And as such, they're having a tough time with the Jewish leadership. So if I speak badly of my brother, and make fun of him and things about him, that's a sibling argument. And I have the right to say certain things to him that the minute someone else walks up and starts saying that, he and I together are going to kick their butt, right? You've seen that happen many times. There's a sibling rivalry, and then there are other people who don't really have a space there. And I feel like what's called anti-Semitic is actually a sibling rivalry. It's harsh for sure. I won't deny any of that. But I will say, I think it's harsh within that sphere rather than just Christians don't like Jews. I think that's a way oversimplifying it. Yeah. So as far as I know, that's when and the best I can guess of who. And none of these folks wrote their names at the bottom of their essays. None of them dated them, and none of them said, here's where I'm writing. So we have to kind of extract all of these things from the best evidence that we can. And there you go. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that the part about Lazarus could have been written by Lazarus.
Right.
And as I read through John, sometimes it seems there is a different voice. And I was wondering if other people could have written parts of the story.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I wondered too, when you said that there were from chapters 2 to 12, it was this language, and then 13 on was a different language.
Right. So let me just step back and give you a sense that that's a great question for all four Gospels. Okay. So here's the general consensus. There are those who disagree. And our friend Lamar Coate, that some of you did not have an opportunity to get to know, he would have been in the disagreement camp here. So I want to honor the disagreeers, but this is the general consensus, is that Mark, whoever Mark is, wrote the Gospel of Mark first. And I'm not aware of any scholarship that feels like there are several different hands in writing Mark's gospel. The second step, some people feel, is that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in hand because they follow almost precisely the arc of Mark's story. Things happen in the order in Matthew and Luke that they happen in Mark's gospel, but they're presented a little differently. So, for example, if you look at the beginning of Luke's gospel, Luke said, many have taken in hand to tell you the things that have transpired among us. And I, after studying everything very carefully, have offered you, O Theophilus, this orderly account of what has happened. Now, the name Theophilus in Greek means friend of God, phileo and theo. So a lover of God, a friend of God. So that could be a person, or it just could be me, you, a lover of God. So we don't know exactly that's to whom he is addressing the gospel, but notice what he said. I have studied all these things and I'm going to give you an orderly account. And it looks like Luke has one copy of Mark in hand and honors it a lot by following the general flow of Mark's stories and picking up on the general truth of Mark's telling. However, there are some stories that are not in Mark, but they're in both Matthew and Luke. So the speculation is that there's another resource out there that was available to Matthew and Luke, not only Mark, but also this other source. And it's called, unfortunately, the Q source. And that's because they're German scholars postulating this. And the German word for source is Quell. So Quell stands for source. So it's the source. You know, it's just the Q source, right? But you'll commonly hear it referred to as the Q source. The idea is this is the compendium of stories that was out there. It was collected, even written down, and that Matthew and Luke had access to it. Possibly it was written down either in a region distant from Mark or at a time after Mark had written, or Mark didn't know about it, or Mark didn't care about it. But you got Mark as a source, you got this Q source that has a number of stories you'll find in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And then you've got some stories that are peculiar to Matthew, just Matthew. And you can name a couple of them. The story of the Magi, only in Matthew, and nowhere else. The Matthew chapter 25 ends Jesus' ministry with 3 parables, one of which has echoes elsewhere, but as 3 parables only appears in Matthew. The last of which is a parable of a sheep and the goats. That's kind of unique to Matthew. And then Luke has some things that are unique to Luke. The birth story. You don't have that really anywhere else. Matthew's got a really bad birth story. Jesus is born in a dependent clause. After Jesus had been born in Bethlehem of Judea, comma, and then it goes on like, well, that's no good. You can't build a pageant out of that. But Luke gives us everything. You got the prophecy of Jesus' birth, you got the prophecy of John the Baptizer's birth. Luke tells those 2 stories together. So from Luke, we get the sense that Jesus and John are related. You don't get that sense in the other Gospels. So all of that's unique to Luke. The parable of the Good Samaritan, only in Luke. Parable of the prodigal son, only in Luke. So here you are, Matthew and Luke. You've got Mark, you've got this Q source, wherever that came from, and you've got other resources at your disposal that you know about. And you do the hard work that Luke talks about of setting things down in an orderly fashion. And you decide, Mark's arc is really accurate. We will follow that. Mark doesn't have a birth story, but I happen to know this story from over here. And this is important because it connects us to the Old Testament there. And then we'll, yada, yada, yada. So those are the three synoptic gospels. The word synoptic, the prefix syn means together. Optic is a visual term. So it means to see together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of see together how this story unfolds, even with all their differences. That's why I kept referring to them as a synoptic gospel. It's very common to call it that. And then, yes, Deborah, John is just totally John. And it may have, well, certainly, John would have different sources. If the speculation is strong that chapters 2 through 12 are a book of signs that existed independently and became a source for John, then that's one. Yeah. And I kind of suspect that's the case.
That would make sense to me.
Yeah, because where the other gospel might call something, even the same thing, a miracle or a healing, John will call it a sign. Semea. It starts with the wedding at Cana where the water is turned into wine. That's called the first sign. And so that language comes up fairly frequently. And you'll remember also then after the resurrection, the story of Thomas. This is unique to John's gospel. And remember the final part of the Thomas story. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. That seems to be circling back to signs. Signs are what you see. Now, just before that, John had said, these things are written so that you might believe. And you've got a whole bunch of emphasis throughout John of seeing and believing. But after the resurrection, John knows he's writing to people who never saw Jesus walk around. They never saw Jesus heal a blind man. They never saw Jesus call Lazarus from the dead. They weren't like the disciples in chapter 12 who followed Jesus because they saw Lazarus raised from the dead. They didn't see any of that. Blessed are you who have not seen and yet believe. These things are written so that you might believe. So now we get a shift from the eyewitness as a purpose of believing to the witness of the scripture, of the writings, as a reason for belief. So John, whenever by whomever is written, is also, I think, reflecting on this transition that's happening from the original eyewitness generation to the second reading generation, who never were there. Well, many of them not even born when these things happen. But they too can believe.
It's a whole religious foundation of Christianity
It's
we
incredible.
haven't seen.
Yeah. I mean, Paul is also writing to people who weren't in Jerusalem, right? He's writing to Romans, he's writing to Galatians, Ephesians, and so forth. He's writing to people who are not eyewitnesses because he refers to those who were eyewitnesses. Paul was not an eyewitness. But boy, don't try to tell him he doesn't know Jesus. He will tell you, I have seen him myself. That, the risen Christ is as real as the baby born on Christmas Day. That's Paul's conviction, and he will fight you over it. he does fight people over it. So that's something we have to remember with all the gospel writers is, if they were eyewitnesses themselves, they're getting a little long in tooth by the time they're starting to write, and they're writing to people that weren't there. So how do you present these stories in a way that is authentic to what actually happened, as authentic as you can be, relying on secondary sources and at the same time encouraging for those who don't even have those sources necessarily to know who the Christ is and to trust in Christ as Lord and Savior, because that's a big thing. So anyway, did you start this with a question? It was June. All right, let's blame it on June. Okay. Yes, Shirley.
The Bible I have followed for your meetings for the last whatever years. My dad, for some reason, used J.B. Phillips a lot.
Yeah.
And which is just one of many, I'm sure. But I appreciate him. And before each chapter, he always gives a synopsis kind of it.
Right.
And, I won't read it, but the first line says, it's quite plain that in this gospel, we are breathing a very different atmosphere from that of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I really was in tune to that.
Yeah.
But he said, whether it's written as a conscious supplement or a deliberate corrective to the other three, we simply do not know. But the majority of Christian scholars, for all their disagreements, would not deny the enormous spiritual value of this document. It seems probable that the author knew Jesus personally, although modern scholarship is mostly against considering him to be the Apostle John. There can be no doubt that the author had close spiritual acquaintance with Christ and had reflected long and deeply on the nature of the divine word. I thought that was kind of nice.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. And
because there's so much and
Yeah.
so many,
Yeah.
and so it's overwhelming. I'm in my 87th year, and I still don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, who does? But I had this conversation, I think, with Deborah at the end of last week's class. At some point, the early church chose which gospels make it into the New Testament. And the question was not, I mean, they weren't in a, this was all happening in the 2nd century now, but they weren't in a position to say which one is accurate because they weren't there either, right?
No.
So their question is, which one is authentic? Which one has integrity? Which one has authority? Those were the questions they're asking because they're trying to include this into what for them was a collection of books that the Christian community should read and what later became the canon of the New Testament. Canon means a measuring rod. There were lots of gospels out there.
I'm sure.
There were a lot. I mean, Luke even alludes to many have taken in hand to tell you all these things. And he obviously disagrees with some of them. So he wants to set the record straight. So the early church has all of these things. I mean, you can find different things called the gospel according to Judas, the gospel according to Bartholomew. I mean, they're just everywhere. And some of them were written like in the 3rd century, people trying to offer their spin on things. So just think of where we are in terms of the layers of connection. At some point in history, Jesus Christ was teaching, preaching, crucified, resurrected. We are not there. None of us was there. What we have are scriptures that were written based on memories of that. So you have the event, you have the memory of the event that becomes part of the oral tradition, people telling the story. And then you have the writing of the event by people who hear some of these traditions and others hear different traditions. And they have to decide which ones are reliable and which ones are not. I mean, they do their homework, they work hard, and they give us what I think we can fairly rely on as a faithful rendition
Right.
of the truth about Jesus Christ, a truth about Jesus Christ, this much truth about Jesus Christ. And then that's written. Then the early church has this period of trying to decide what's authentic and what's not. The Gospel of Thomas, if you ever read that, It's weird. It's not like a gospel. It's not really a story. It's just kind of a collection of saying, many of which are in fact found in the other gospels. Some of which are kind of their own thing. There was great debate whether that belonged in the New Testament or not. It kind of was like in the expanded version. The extra, what's that when you show a movie and they show you pieces that were cut out at the last minute? Right, the extended version. You got that, and then you got some that are just so freaking crazy that early church would like to get that out of here. There is a gospel. There is a different book called the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus is a child and he's taking the mud and he makes little clay pigeons and throws them in the air and they fly away. Nobody thinks that's true. They just feel like that's somebody going wonky on us. So you got the event, the oral tradition around the event, the written, the editorial act of which of these written accounts are authentic. We ended up with 4, and they're different. And the early church is fine with that. They saw the difference too. It's not like they didn't know that it was different. The Gospel of John is so different that J.B. Phillips says, you're going to have a different experience reading this book. And then the other layers we have are translators. Because now we're going from Greek into originally Latin. And then you get finally the King James Bible, let's say in English, based on the Latin more than the Greek. I mean, they were Greek scholars as well, but they took the Latin very seriously. And you get to the 20th century, you have other translations that have better sources because we discovered more ancient manuscripts than what the King James Bible had at their disposal. Mm. So there are things in the King James Bible that other translations don't put in there. They're not in there. A whole verse might be missing. A whole story might be missing. The story of the woman caught in the act of adultery that was going to be stoned is not in the earliest version of John's Gospel. Sorry. I know, it's your favorite story.
Just a giant game of telephone.
Well, not just, but inevitably. Inevitably a giant game. And look, anything that's passed down through history is going to go through this. This is history. This is human. This is how humans operate. So is it reliable? It depends on what you mean by reliable. What are you looking for as truth? Are you looking for historicity? Well, you can be very skeptical in that sense. One donkey or a donkey in a sidecar. You don't know, right? The historicity. You have 2 reliable witnesses that present that story differently. And because they present it differently, it tells us that they are less pretending to be news sources on the scene. I saw this myself, and more, they are theologically interpreting the story they received and reaching to Zechariah to say, this is what's happening. This is what's happening, my friends. This is what's happening. The prophecy of Zechariah, which is against the horses and the chariots. That's the issue here, right? So they are telling, when they're telling the story, they are interpreting even the oral tradition they receive and giving it to us. Our translators have to make interpretive judgments because no language translates to another language one-to-one perfect translation. You know that if you speak more than one language. And then you have commentators who are like the 6th level of interpretation here, doing our very best to try to figure out where things come from and occasionally skating behind the text and saying, maybe this was written first and this was written second. And then there's you at the top of this mountain. Surveyor of all these things. And you have a choice, right? And these are real choices. You can pick up your Bible and just kind of read it and say, wow, thank you, God.
That's true.
And it can speak to you, and it can shape you, and it can draw you to the Christ.
Which is what it does.
You can also read it and then notice, wait a minute.
Yes.
Over in this chapter, there was only one animal. No, there are two, right? You can read it critically, and you're not being unfaithful when you do that. You are given a brain in order to use it. So you've got that, right? You can read it critically. You can read it devotionally. You can read it with an exterior interest or an interior interest. My suggestion is, as a person of faith, you are part of the inner circle here, reading this story. This is a story from one of your siblings who is a follower of Christ, inviting you to hear this
The message.
gospel, good news about Christ. And so you're relating to this writer, even though it's gone through all of these layers of translation, interpretation, manuscripts, some of which have this and some of which don't. I think the oldest manuscript we have of any New Testament gospel is called P46. And it's about 3 verses out of John chapter 17. So the oldest manuscripts are not intact. They are piecemeal, and they have to be brought together. It's not until, 3rd or 4th century you're going to find a document that's kind of a whole. I went to see the Dead Sea Scrolls once. This was one of my favorite things ever. I'm almost done. So you got these Dead Sea Scrolls. These are scrolls that were put into these clay jars and hidden by these communities that were, trying to stay away from the empire. And they happened to be found by a little boy one time who was throwing rocks at an animal to try to get it to go back to the herd. And he heard it break something that was clay. And he went and found all these clay jars. And turned out these were scriptures. And some of the oldest manuscripts we have. And it was discovered, and someone told somebody, and finally, all of these scholars came in from Great Britain, I think it was. And because I think they were controlling Palestine at the time. And they took it, and one of the first things they did was they took out these scrolls and they taped them up on these things in order to start translating and reading and carbon dating and all that stuff. And the tape did to these ancient manuscripts more damage than 2,000 years almost of being in these clay jars. I mean, you want to talk about the arrogance of modernization, right? They have been preserved beautifully through thick, thin weather, everything. And it's these scientists with tape that destroy them. Don't be the tape, y'all. We read these things, and there are many reasons to question them, many reasons to be skeptical about certain things. But the overwhelming thing is this is the good news of the gospel. And I'm going to leave you just with this, is Jesus a king or is Jesus not a king? And again, I think the most faithful answer we can come up with is yes. So with that, I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
All right,
I like
thanks.
that.
I would have said no.